Maxwell Cain held his phone tightly, his eyes glued to the stock market numbers that seemed to dance across the screen. The December wind whipped through the city's towering buildings, but to Maxwell, it was just another ordinary day. He stopped at a traffic light, and beside him, a man in tattered clothes stared at him. "Sir, do you have anything to eat?" The voice was deep but polite, almost timid. Maxwell didn't even need to look. He replied with disdain, dismissing the man as if crumpling a piece of paper, "If you begged less and did more, maybe you wouldn't need to ask." Across the street, the sound of laughter echoed. Maxwell resumed his hurried stride, carrying the indifference of someone who believed he was above everything and everyone. To him, people like that man were like smudges on a luxury car window, annoying but easy to ignore. The man standing on the sidewalk was Ellis Carter, a veteran who was all too familiar with the weight of loss. Unemployment, divorce, and the death of his only son had driven Ellis to life on the streets. He didn't respond to the humiliation. He simply lowered his head and continued holding the cardboard sign that read, "Any help is appreciated." The words were simple, but they carried years of pain. Maxwell moved on, but that moment didn't escape Ellis's notice. Deep down, he knew that life has a way of coming full circle. At that moment, Maxwell was on top, but life has a curious way of leveling the playing field. And Maxwell would learn that lesson the hard way. The sidewalk where Ellis Carter lived wasn't just a place to beg, it was a refuge where he tried to piece together the fragments of a shattered life. Before everything fell apart, Ellis had a modest home and a steady job at a warehouse in a small town. He was an ordinary man with an easy smile and a generous heart. And then came the war. Ellis was 32 when he got the news that he'd be deployed to the Middle East. His wife, Margaret, stayed home with their 8-year-old son, Samuel, promising to keep everything together until his return. But Ellis never came back the same. The weight of seeing friends fall in combat and the guilt of surviving followed him like a shadow. When he returned home, he realized time hadn't waited for him. Margaret filed for divorce, tired of trying to save someone too lost to rescue. Then, one rainy night, Samuel was killed by a drunk driver while walking home from school. Ellis never recovered. With no family, no support, and a heart full of sorrow, he tried to move on. But depression eroded his job, his health, and, little by little, his dignity. The warehouse closed its doors, and Ellis found himself homeless, wandering the streets of a city that never welcomed him. Even so, Ellis didn't completely give up. He still found strength to help other homeless individuals, sharing the little he had and listening to stories as heavy as his own. That's what kept him going, the idea that even with nothing, he could still do something for someone else. The day Maxwell humiliated him, Ellis felt a familiar weight in his chest, but it wasn't anger. He knew what it felt like to be overlooked. And he also knew that Maxwell's pain hadn't even started yet. After all, life always finds a way to return what you put out into the world. For Maxwell Cain, the world was a chessboard where he always played the most skilled hand. Business deals, contracts, and negotiations were the pieces he maneuvered with precision. But what he didn't realize was that while he relied on the absolute control of his strategies, someone was pulling the rug out from under him. The betrayal came from the least expected source, his longtime partner and friend, Jonathan Hale. On a gray morning, Maxwell stepped into his luxurious office, just as he did every day. But this time, the employees' gazes were different. They avoided his eyes, their greetings absent. On his assistant's desk, an envelope awaited him. Inside were documents confirming the unthinkable: Jonathan had embezzled millions, manipulating the company's shares. Maxwell was broke. The hours that followed were a whirlwind. He tried contacting lawyers and shareholders, but the news spread like wildfire. Banks froze his accounts, investors pulled out, and before he knew it, Maxwell was sitting alone in his office, surrounded by furniture he could no longer afford. His perfect life was crumbling before his eyes. By the end of the day, Maxwell returned home, only to find something worse waiting for him: an eviction notice. The luxury he'd lived in, fine dining and imported cars, was no longer his reality. He tried calling his contacts, but none of his calls were returned. The same people who once admired him now avoided him like the plague. That night, Maxwell left his mansion with just one suitcase. Standing outside the gates, he looked up at the iron bars and let out a nervous laugh. He never imagined the man who had it all could lose everything in a matter of days. He glanced at the sky, searching for answers that didn't come, and walked aimlessly into the streets, carrying a deep emptiness that felt impossible to fill. As he wandered, he saw faces he had never noticed before, people in alleyways, sitting on park benches, holding cardboard signs. Maxwell felt something he had never felt before, fear. The same fear he used to ignore when passing by those very people. And this was just the beginning. Maxwell Cain sat on a wooden bench in a public park, his suitcase containing his last belongings by his side. The expensive suit he always wore was now wrinkled, and his Italian shoes were coated in dust. He watched people pass by, but no one looked him in the eye. To them, he was just another lost face in the crowd. For the first time, Maxwell understood what it meant to be invisible. Hunger gnawed at him. Across the street, he spotted a cafe where well-dressed people laughed and chatted. Instinctively, he reached into his pocket for his wallet, only to remember he no longer had credit cards or cash. He took a deep breath, swallowing the lump in his throat, and looked away. As night fell, Maxwell sought shelter in a park where other homeless people had gathered. The air reeked of trash and cheap cigarette smoke. He felt out of place, unable to blend in, yet he had nowhere else to go. First time. The question came from a gray-bearded man sitting by a makeshift fire. Maxwell hesitated, then nodded slightly. The man chuckled softly. "Yeah, you don't look like you'll last long out here." Maxwell wanted to retort, but whatever pride he had left was smothered by reality. The man was right. Later that night, as Maxwell tried to sleep in a dark corner of the park, he realized something crucial: he had no idea how to survive on the streets. The cold bit at his skin, and he could hear laughter from a distant group, likely enjoying some joke. It reminded him of the events where he was the center of attention, but now, he was utterly alone, with no one to turn to. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Maxwell wandered the streets with an empty stomach. Passing by a diner, he saw a man toss part of a sandwich into the trash. Humiliation overcame him as he instinctively reached for it. It didn't last long. A passing woman shouted, "Hey! Don't you have any shame?" Embarrassed, he dropped the sandwich and walked away quickly, fighting back tears. Later, as he aimlessly roamed the streets, Maxwell froze at the sight of a familiar figure, Ellis Carter, the very man he had once dismissed. Ellis sat on the sidewalk, holding his cardboard sign, his expression weary but calm. Maxwell hesitated. Part of him wanted to run, but another part knew he had no choice. It was a moment of reckoning. For the first time, Maxwell swallowed his pride, approached slowly, and said in a low voice, "I need a little help." Maxwell's days on the streets began with a persistent denial. He still wore the suit he had brought from his last meeting, even though it was now dirty and wrinkled. He walked past people with his chin held high, as if believing that at any moment, someone would recognize him and rescue him from this new reality. But time was merciless. Hunger, cold, and the absence of answers forced him to confront the truth: Maxwell Cain was just another invisible face in the crowd. By the third night, the loneliness was crushing. He tried to sleep on a park bench, but the cold was unbearable. His fingers, once adorned with expensive watches and rings, were now purple and trembling. Every cell in his body begged for warmth, but pride still kept him from asking for help. In the distance, he saw a group of people gathered around a small fire. Maxwell stood frozen, watching as the smell of cheap soup filled the air. It was so far removed from his old life that it felt like a nightmare. An older woman with gray hair, wrapped in a patched coat, noticed his hesitation and called out, "Hey, come over here before the cold kills you." Maxwell hesitated, but his need for warmth won out. He approached the group and sat down in silence, avoiding everyone's gaze. The hot soup burned his throat, but the warmth was comforting. For the first time, he felt a mixture of shame and gratitude. The woman beside him extended a warm blanket and said, "We've all got a story, son. You're not alone." Maxwell tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat. That night, Maxwell realized something he had never considered before: the streets weren't just a place but a constant state of vulnerability. He saw faces he had ignored before, heard stories he'd never bothered to listen to. And amidst those stories, Maxwell began to understand what true humiliation was: not losing money but losing the humanity he had never valued. On the fifth morning, Maxwell faced what he considered the final blow. Wandering aimlessly, he caught his reflection in a store window. The man staring back at him was unrecognizable, dirty, exhausted, with deep shadows under his eyes. In that instant, the weight of who he had become hit him like a punch. And in that moment of fragility, he saw Ellis again. Ellis was sitting on the same sidewalk where Maxwell had dismissed him days before, holding the same cardboard sign. When their eyes met, Maxwell froze. There was no scorn or anger on Ellis's face, just an unsettling calm. Maxwell slowly approached, and before he could say a word, Ellis asked, "Need some help?" Maxwell stared at Ellis as if he were seeing a ghost. The last time their eyes met, Maxwell had been a powerful, untouchable man. Now, he was a shadow of his former self. Shame made his lips tremble, but before he could speak, Ellis stood up and extended a hand. "You look tired. Let's get you something to eat." It was the first time anyone had treated him with kindness since his downfall. Maxwell tried to refuse, muttering something about being fine, but his empty stomach betrayed him. Ellis simply smiled with the patience of someone who understood such resistance. "I thought I could handle it on my own too." They walked to a line for free meal distribution. Ellis seemed at ease in the environment, greeting others as if they were old friends. Maxwell, on the other hand, felt every glance in his direction like a dagger. When they finally got their meals, Ellis sat beside him on a nearby bench, eating slowly. "You learn to appreciate the simple things when you've got nothing," Ellis remarked, breaking a piece of bread and handing half to Maxwell. Over the next few days, Ellis began teaching Maxwell how to survive on the streets, where to find safe shelters, how to locate food near grocery store dumpsters. "It's humiliating at first, but hunger is a good teacher," Ellis said without a trace of bitterness. Maxwell listened in silence, struggling to accept this new reality. Every lesson was a cruel reminder of how much he had ignored the lives around him when he had everything. One night, as they shared a thin blanket under an awning, Ellis shared his story. Maxwell listened intently, not interrupting. When Ellis spoke of his son's death, Maxwell felt a lump in his throat. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about himself. "Why are you helping me?" Maxwell finally asked, breaking the silence. Ellis shrugged and replied simply, "Because someone helped me once, and it saved my life." Maxwell couldn't respond. He just stared at the sky as Ellis's words echoed in his mind. Ellis wasn't just teaching Maxwell how to survive, he was, without realizing it, showing him what it meant to be human. As time passed, Maxwell began to adapt to his new reality. The streets remained a cruel place, but now he had something he never thought possible, a genuine human connection. Ellis wasn't just a guide in survival but also a living example of strength and resilience. Maxwell watched the way Ellis treated others on the streets, with patience and generosity, even when he had almost nothing to give. One morning, Maxwell saw Ellis pull a piece of bread from his backpack and share it with a woman sobbing on the ground. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough to bring a shy smile to her face. Maxwell couldn't help but remember how many times he'd ignored similar situations. The shame pressed against his chest, a weight he didn't know how to carry. That night, as they rested under a bridge, Ellis turned to Maxwell and asked, have you ever thought that life takes these turns to teach us something? Maxwell, who had been silent for hours, answered honestly, if that's true, I don't think I've learned the lesson yet. Ellis gave him a sad but reassuring smile. You'll understand when you're ready. The most defining moment came days later. Maxwell, who now helped Ellis gather leftover food from markets, witnessed a man being violently thrown out of a diner for trying to grab scraps. The manager shouted words Maxwell recognized because they had once come from his own mouth, "Go get a job instead of begging." It hit like a punch. Maxwell froze, reliving all the times he'd said or done the same. When the man walked away, his head hung low, Ellis called out to him and offered an apple he'd found earlier. Maxwell watched, unable to comprehend how someone who had so little could give so much. For the first time, he mustered the courage to ask, "Why do you do this? You've already lost everything." Ellis answered without hesitation, "Because it's not about what I've lost, it's about what I can still give. Sometimes, that's all we have." Maxwell swallowed hard, feeling an invisible weight inside him shift. It was as if something he had never understood was finally starting to make sense. It was a damp night, the streets glistening under the dim glow of streetlights, when Maxwell and Ellis faced what seemed to be their greatest test yet. After days of collecting small amounts of money, Ellis decided it was time to help a friend who was in even worse shape. A man named Roger, known for his fragile health, was sick and living in even more dire conditions. Ellis suggested using the little they had managed to scrape together to buy medicine for Roger. Maxwell hesitated. The idea of spending the small amount they had painstakingly earned seemed absurd, especially considering how much effort it had taken. "If we give it all away now, what are we going to do tomorrow?" Maxwell asked, frustrated. Ellis remained calm. "We'll figure out tomorrow. But today, he needs it more than we do." The argument was brief. Deep down, Maxwell knew Ellis was right, but giving in felt like surrendering the last bit of control he still clung to. Reluctantly, he followed Ellis to a small pharmacy. The pharmacist eyed the two shabbily dressed men with suspicion but sold them the medicine. Each coin Ellis placed on the counter felt like a burden being lifted from Maxwell, but it also left him with a new and uncomfortable feeling: responsibility. When they arrived at Roger's makeshift shelter, the scene was devastating. The man was curled up in a corner, coughing incessantly, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. Ellis knelt beside him and spoke with the same gentle tone he often used with Maxwell. "It's going to be okay. We brought what you need." Maxwell watched in silence as Ellis cared for his friend, handing over the medicine and covering him with his own coat. In that moment, Maxwell witnessed something he had never experienced before: the power of genuine altruism. There was nothing to gain, no reward, no advantage, just the simple desire to help someone make it through another day. He realized that Ellis's generosity wasn't an occasional gesture but a deliberate, consistent choice. Later, as they walked back to their improvised shelter, Maxwell broke the silence. "How do you do it? Helping people every day without expecting anything in return?" Ellis stopped, looked at him, and replied simply, "Because one day, it could be me in his place. And if it is, I'd want someone to do the same for me." Maxwell didn't respond. He just walked beside Ellis, feeling something shift deep within, a glimmer of understanding that life was about more than he had ever imagined. Maxwell and Ellis had been walking side by side for weeks, learning to face each day as it came. What began as a relationship between a survivor and an apprentice had grown into something much deeper. Maxwell still struggled with his pride but couldn't deny his growing admiration for Ellis, who seemed to see the world in a way Maxwell never could. One day, during one of their walks, Maxwell spotted an old building in the heart of the city. Its facade was worn, but something about it caught his attention. He stopped, staring at the floors covered in posters and advertisements. "I know this building," he murmured, more to himself than to Ellis. Ellis looked at him curiously. "How do you know it?" Maxwell pointed to the faded name at the top, Kane and Company. It was one of Maxwell's earliest acquisitions, years ago. He had purchased the building as part of a real estate speculation deal, only to abandon it when the renovation plans didn't yield immediate returns. At the time, Maxwell prided himself on cutting his losses without a second thought. Now, he stared at the building as though it were a reflection of his own life, something left behind, full of wasted potential. Noticing Maxwell's expression, Ellis offered, "If it's yours, why not do something with it?" Maxwell let out a bitter laugh. "Because I'm no one now. And even if I were, no one's going to listen to a man who's lost everything." Ellis was silent for a moment before replying, "You think you have to be a billionaire to make a difference? I've got nothing, but I help people every day." Those words lingered in Maxwell's mind. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He envisioned the building transformed, a shelter for people like Ellis, like Roger, like himself. A place where those who had been forgotten could find hope. The idea seemed absurd, but for the first time in years, Maxwell felt something he hadn't in a long time: purpose. The next morning, Maxwell decided to act. He started frequenting the public library, using their computers to research how to regain possession of the building and seek funding. He endured curious stares from others but learned to ignore them. Ellis accompanied him, offering quiet support. "If you need me to, I can help talk to people. They listen more when someone who understands their struggles speaks up." Though Maxwell had lost his former prestige, he still had something valuable: knowledge. He used his skills to draft a proposal, reaching out to small local businesses that might benefit from supporting a social project. Together, he and Ellis visited offices, knocked on doors, and faced rejection after rejection. Yet, every small victory renewed Maxwell's confidence. When two investors finally agreed to fund the project, Maxwell felt a relief sweeter than any contract he'd signed in the past. He knew it was just the beginning, but for the first time, he was building something meaningful. Maxwell's idea had become a concrete plan. The abandoned building now had a purpose, and the first stages of renovation were underway. Every brick laid and every wall painted symbolized more than physical construction; it was a reflection of Maxwell's own rebuilding. But, as Ellis had warned from the start, the road was far from smooth. One evening, as Maxwell and Ellis worked through paperwork at a small table in the public library, Maxwell received an unexpected call. It was one of the investors. The voice on the other end was cold and direct: "Kane, we're pulling out. The risk outweighs the return." Maxwell felt the ground fall out from under him. He tried to argue, but the line went dead before he could finish. The blow was devastating. Without financial support, the entire project was in jeopardy. Ellis noticed Maxwell's despair and said, "Maybe this is what separates those who truly believe from those who are just trying." Maxwell remained silent, Ellis's words echoing in his mind. He wanted to believe he could keep going, but he didn't know how. That night, Maxwell returned to the building and sat on its steps. The place felt colder than ever, the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. He spent hours there, reflecting on all the choices that had brought him to this moment. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he couldn't do it alone. The next morning, he shared his frustration with Ellis. The former soldier simply replied, "So why not ask for help? Sometimes that's all people need to hear." Maxwell hesitated but eventually relented. Using his communication skills, he organized a meeting with small business owners, community members, and even other homeless individuals. Ellis was the first to speak, sharing his story with raw honesty. Maxwell followed, admitting his mistakes and asking for their support in turning the building into a shelter. The response was overwhelming. People began showing up with donations: clothes, food, even building materials. A local merchant offered unused lumber, and a carpenter volunteered to help with renovations. For the first time, Maxwell saw something he had never understood before: when people feel seen and valued, they give more than anyone expects. Ellis stood by his side throughout, guiding the conversations and proving that Maxwell still had something valuable, an idea that resonated. It's not about what you've lost, Ellis said. It's about what you choose to do with what you still have. By the end of the day, Maxwell felt something new, gratitude. Not for what he had accomplished, but for what he had learned. And, for the first time in a long while, he realized he was building something no one could ever take away. The building that was once just an abandoned shell now buzzed with life. The sound of hammers, saws, and laughter filled the air as volunteers and residents worked side by side. The shelter wasn't finished yet, but what Maxwell saw there was more than concrete and wood. It was a symbol of what people can build together when they believe in something greater than themselves. Maxwell walked through the freshly painted hallways, taking in every detail with a mix of pride and humility. Ellis was beside him, carrying a stack of donated blankets. "We're almost there," Ellis said with a small smile. Maxwell nodded, though the lump in his throat made it hard to speak. It wasn't just the building that was transforming, it was him. That night, Maxwell gathered all the volunteers to express his gratitude. Standing on a makeshift platform, he looked at the faces before him. Some were homeless individuals who had contributed their labor, others were local business owners, and still others were strangers who believed in the vision. "I spent most of my life thinking that a man's worth was measured by what he could buy," Maxwell began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And when I lost everything, I thought I had nothing left to offer." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But you all showed me I was wrong. Today, I see that true wealth is here." He gestured to the crowd, his voice faltering slightly. "It's in each and every one of you." As applause filled the room, Maxwell stepped down from the platform and walked toward Ellis, who was waiting in the back. "You made this happen," Maxwell said, his voice thick with gratitude. Ellis shook his head and replied, "No. We made this happen. And there's still more people out there who need help." In the months that followed, the project became a beacon of hope for the city. Maxwell used his skills to organize fundraising events, attract more volunteers, and host workshops at the shelter. Ellis became the heart of the place, known by everyone as the man who welcomed each person with the same warm smile. Despite the successes, Maxwell never forgot where he had started, or how he had gotten there. One evening, he returned to the park bench where it all began, the spot where Ellis had found him. Sitting there, he reflected on how much his life had changed, not just around him, but within him. Watching the flow of people on the street, Maxwell grasped a simple yet profound truth: what truly matters isn't what you own, but the impact you leave on others' lives. And what about you? Have you ever had a moment when you needed help from someone you never expected? Or have you helped someone who ended up transforming your life? Share your story in the comments, I'd love to hear it.